Hi, everybody. Welcome back to a new episode of Let's Finish the Thought. My name is Angelus, and today I have a very important topic for you. Something that has been eating at me forever. It might be like a thread, like you might imagine it as being a red thread throughout all my episodes. But today I want to touch on it. So let's just jump right in. I was sitting here in my studio, scrolling through Instagram, as one does, mindlessly scrolling, and something hit me so hard that I actually stopped and stared at my phone because the contrast was fucking crazy. So I was scrolling and came across a video of an influencer. Some influencer showing off their car, huge house, pool, garage full of cars, luxury, everything, right? So I scrolled again. Next video, Skid Row, Los Angeles. People sleeping in tents, people addicted, people sleeping on the sidewalk. And then I scrolled again. Again, someone showing off their vacation home, designer watch, fifth car. I scrolled again, back to people who haven't eaten properly in days. And I sat there thinking, how the hell is this normal? How have we collectively decided that this is just fine? Because I genuinely do not understand it. Why do you need 6 cars? Why do you need a house so big it can fit 10 families? Why are we okay with some people having more money than they could spend in 10 lifetimes, while people are literally sleeping on the sidewalk in a tent right across the street? And I'm not even saying this as an attack on specific people. I'm asking a genuine question. Why is this acceptable to us as a society? Because the more I think about it, the more absurd it becomes. And here's something that really messes with my brain. Let's say tomorrow I suddenly become famous, right? Let's say I become an actor, I make millions. Let's say I move into a giant mansion next to Johnny Depp. Suddenly, I'm invited to their parties. Suddenly, people listen to what I say. Suddenly, I'm treated as equal. But why? What changed about my value as a human being? Was I somehow less of a person before the money showed up? Because if that's how our society works, then something is fundamentally broken. And the more I sat there thinking about this, the more one thought kept coming back to me. Maybe we're trying to solve the wrong problems. Maybe instead of constantly arguing about crime, politics, and symptoms, because that's what they are, we should be focusing on the basic, more necessary question. What would happen if we removed the pressure that causes most of these problems in the first place? What if every human being had a guaranteed foundation? Food, housing, basic security. Let's say $3,000 a month. Enough to live, enough to breathe. Not luxury, stability. Because if you remove the constant fear of survival from people's lives, something very interesting might start to happen. And that's the thought I want to walk through with you today. So let's go ahead and sit with that concept for a second. Sit with the contrast. On one side of the screen, you have someone that's buying a $300,000 car. Maybe it's their fifth car, maybe it's their second car. Doesn't matter. On the other side, you have someone who's wondering where their next meal is coming from. And we've somehow built a system where both of those things can exist at the same time. And we treat that as normal. But if you zoom out for a moment, the question becomes unavoidable. How did we decide that this system is fair? Because the more you think about it, the stranger it becomes. Because tell me, at what point did we decide that unlimited wealth for some people was more important than basic fucking security for everyone? And this is where the thought experiment begins for me. Because if the goal is a society that actually works for everyone, then maybe the first thing we need to do is have a foundation and a limit. A foundation for everyone and a cap at the top. Okay, so the foundation is simple. Everyone gets basic security: housing, food, a basic income. Let's say $3,000 a month. Enough to live, enough so that no one is terrified about survival. But if you add a foundation, you also need something else: a ceiling. Because if wealth can accumulate infinitely, at the top, the imbalance will simply rebuild itself. So imagine a system where people can absolutely run businesses, create companies, invent things, and build things, but there's a cap. Once someone reaches a certain level of wealth, anything beyond that point flows back into society, not as punishment, just as balance. So people then ask me, what about businesses? Fine, keep your business. If someone builds something like Amazon, great. That's innovation. That's work. But once personal wealth reaches a certain level, the excess doesn't keep stacking up forever. It flows back to the people whose lives exist in that same system. Now take education. If we want the best doctors, best engineers, scientists, teachers, then education should be free. Not easier, the standards should be the same. Because if you want to go to medical school, the tests are still hard, the training is still demanding. Because we want real doctors, but the door should not be locked by money. And this is where people usually say, well, if you remove huge financial rewards, people won't do difficult jobs anymore. I'm not convinced that's true. A perfect example is Neil deGrasse Tyson. Does anyone honestly think that he studies the universe because of a paycheck? No, he does that because he loves it. That's purpose. On the other hand, take soccer players, for example. Some of them make millions every year just for playing a sport. Now propose this question: would they still play soccer if they were paid the same as everyone else? Some probably wouldn't, but that just leaves the ones that actually play it for the love of the game. Because if you don't want to do it, then don't do it. If you are a doctor just because you make a lot of money, then you shouldn't be a doctor in the first place. Sorry, not sorry, it's the truth. And when you do that, something interesting happens. The system stops rewarding accumulation and starts revealing motivation. People start doing things because they actually care about them, because they're curious, because they want to contribute, and because it matters to them. And once you start imagining a world where everybody has a foundation and no one can accumulate infinite wealth at the top, something else changes. And that's where the chain reaction begins. So let's continue the thought. Imagine we did this. Imagine every person had housing. Imagine every person had a basic income of $3,000 a month. Enough to live, enough to breathe. And imagine that wealth couldn't stack infinitely at the top. Now ask yourself the real question: what happens next? The first thing that changes is survival pressure. Right now, millions of people are making decisions under stress. They're worried about rent, worried about food, and worried about losing their jobs. That pressure shapes behavior. Take something like petty crime: the kid that robs a gas station because their family hasn't eaten. That situation disappears. Not because people suddenly become saints, but because the reason for the crime is gone. And once survival is guaranteed, something interesting happens to human motivation. People stop working purely to survive. They work because something matters to them. Someone becomes a doctor because they want to heal people. Someone becomes a scientist because they're curious about the universe. Someone becomes a game designer like me because they love building worlds. And someone becomes a teacher because they love helping children learn. Right now, there are people who would love to become doctors, but they never will. Not because they're incapable, but because medical school costs a fucking fortune. Somewhere out there might be a person that could discover a breakthrough treatment or save lives for the next 40 years. Someone who could cure fucking cancer, and they will never get a chance because the door is locked by money. And when you remove that barrier, something powerful happens. People start choosing work based on the purpose instead of fear. People that become doctors because they actually want to be doctors. People who become teachers who actually want to teach children. Teachers would have the same amount of money as everybody else. So they could teach. Right now, multiple people that would want to teach don't pick teaching as a job because it doesn't pay enough. And instead of fixing the fucking system, we're all out here complaining about our kids not getting a right education. Fix the problem, then that goes away. Action, consequence. And when you do that, something else begins to fade. The hierarchy. Because right now, our society ranks people by money. The richer someone is, the more important we treat them. But the idea falls apart once everybody has a stable foundation. Because human dignity should never depend on economic position. A person isn't more valuable because they have more money. A person isn't less valuable because they have less. And when survival pressure and hierarchy fade, people start focusing on different things: friendship, community, creativity, curiosity, learning, and building things together. And when you start imagining that world, when the pressure disappears, the people who will still harm others stand out immediately. Now, at this point, someone usually asks me an important question, and it's a fair one. A friend of mine actually asked me something like this: okay, even if you did all that, people are still people. People will still argue, and people will still find reasons to fight. What about that? And I think that's a very good question. Because, yes, humans will be humans. People will disagree, people will have conflicts, and we're not suddenly turning into perfect angels. But here's what that changes. Right now, bad behavior hides inside chaos. We live in a world where millions of people are under constant pressure just to survive. They're worried about food, rent, debt, jobs, and healthcare. That pressure creates noise, and inside that noise, a lot of things slip by without people really questioning them. But imagine a society where that pressure is gone. Everybody has housing, everybody has food, and everybody has basic stability. Suddenly, people aren't distracted by survival anymore. Suddenly, they have the mental space to pay attention. And when you remove the background noise, you see it. People who still choose to harm others stand out immediately. Because if everyone's basic needs are met, then someone that still chooses aggression, domination, or unnecessary conflict, there's no survival excuse left. Their behavior becomes obvious. Take geopolitical conflicts as an example. Leaders often justify actions by saying they're protecting resources, territory, or strategic interests. By imagining a world where basic needs are met and guaranteed for everyone, a lot of those justifications would suddenly sound very different. People would start asking, is this really necessary? When society isn't constantly worried about survival, people gain clarity to ask questions like that. And the individuals who are acting purely out of power, ego, or domination would become much easier to recognize. They would stand out like a sore fucking thumb. Stupid shit like Captain Orange trying to take over Greenland and Mr. Russia trying to take over Ukraine. Honestly, sometimes I wish I could put those two in a room with their mothers and let the conversation happen. Like, what are you doing? Why are people dying because of this? Because if you're going to send thousands of people into war, at the very least, you should have the courage to stand where they're standing. Take Alexander the Great, for example. That guy didn't sit comfortably in a palace while other people fought for him. He was literally in the front line with his troops. He led the charge and got wounded multiple times because he was actually there. No, I'm not saying we should go back to conquering half the world like Alexander did. That's not the point. The point is this: if you believe in war so strongly enough to send thousands of people into it, maybe you should be standing in the front line too. Funny how that changes some decisions. And honestly, part of me looks at this not like a philosopher or a political expert, but as a mom. Because when kids are fighting, every parent knows exactly what to do. You separate them, you sit them down, and you say, all right, time out. Nobody's going anywhere until we calm down and figure this out. You take away the toys, you take away the distractions, and you make them talk to each other. Because that's what we teach our children, right? You don't solve problems by hitting each other. You stop, you think, and you talk. And sometimes I look at the world stage and I think maybe we need a little more of that logic. Strip away the power, strip away the money, and strip away the influence for a second. And just put the people making these decisions in the same room together and say, all right, time out, sit down, talk to each other, and figure it the fuck out. Because if we expect our kids to learn that lesson, maybe the adults running the world should remember it too. Anyway, enough with the rant, Ange. Let's get back to topic. Now, there's another consequence of all this that people don't think about. The justice system itself would change. Because if you look closely at a lot of crime today, a huge portion of it is driven by cruelty, is driven by pressure. That 17-year-old kid who robs a gas station, that kid isn't thinking about becoming a criminal mastermind. He's thinking about feeding his fucking family. That doesn't make a robbery right. Say that 10 times fast. But it tells you something about the situation. Look at fraud cases. Look at financial crimes. A lot of those come from people drowning in debt, trying to survive in a system that constantly pushes them to spend money they don't have. In many parts of Europe, by the way, credit culture is way less dominant. People are generally taught something much more simple. If you don't have the money, don't spend it. That alone removes a huge amount of financial pressure. Now imagine a world where everybody already has the basics covered: housing, food, stability. Suddenly, a huge category of crime disappears. Not because people became perfect, but because a reason for that crime vanishes. The kid doesn't need to rob the gas station anymore. The family isn't drowning in debt. The pressure that pushed people in those kinds of situations simply isn't there. And when those survival crimes disappear, the people who genuinely want to hurt others become much easier to see. The predators, the violent offenders, the people who cause harm simply because they choose to. Those individuals stand out immediately, which means that the justice system can finally focus on what it's supposed to focus on in the first place: protecting people from those who truly want to harm them. Right now, our justice system spends enormous energy chasing survival crimes created by a broken system. But if we fix the foundation, those cases would shrink dramatically. And what would be left would be the people whose actions reveal who they truly are. So let's bring this all together for a second. Because the issue itself is not that complicated. Look at the world around us. People are sleeping on sidewalks. People are living in tents. People are wondering where their next meal is coming from. And at the exact same time, there are people with more money than they could spend in 10 lifetimes. Houses big enough for 10 families. Garages filled with cars. Wealth stacked so high it becomes abstract. And somehow, we normalize that contrast. Somehow, we accepted that this is just how the world works. So I ask myself one very simple question. What would happen if we fixed the foundation first? What if every human had a guaranteed base? Housing, food, healthcare, education. A basic income, something like $3,000 a month, enough for stability, not luxury, just a floor so nobody falls through. Now follow the thought with me. If that foundation exists, then survival pressure disappears. If survival pressure disappears, then desperation crimes begin to disappear. If desperation crimes disappear, the justice system suddenly becomes lighter and clearer. If people no longer are terrified about survival, they can start focusing on what actually matters. If education is accessible, more people can become what they are actually meant to become: doctors, engineers, scientists, teachers. The people who might discover the next medical breakthrough, the cure for fucking cancer. Those people that might actually get a fucking chance because the door was never locked by money in the first place. And when survival pressure disappears, people will start seeing each other differently. Not as competitors for survival, but as equals. And when the noise disappears, the people who still harm others, the bad actors, they'll stand out. Because suddenly there's no excuse left. So as we finish this episode, I want to leave you with something that is very important to me. Because this is where society genuinely confuses me. Because sometimes it feels like we're watching the house burn and everybody is politely debating whether or not it's really on fire. Let me explain what I mean. Imagine your house is on fire. Not metaphorically, literally. The flames are coming out of your windows, the roof is starting to collapse. You're standing outside watching everything you have and everything you care about burn. So you call the fire department. They show up, the truck is there, the hoses are there, the firefighters are standing right in front of your fucking house. And somehow, in our strange version of reality, you are expected to politely convince them to put the fire out. You have to explain that the fire is a problem, you have to phrase it carefully, and you have to make sure you don't upset anyone. You have to present the argument in the right way so people will listen. And all the while, the house is still burning. And that's what it feels like to me. We see people hungry, we see people living in tents, we see the contrast between unimaginable wealth and people who can't survive. And instead of saying, this is obviously a problem, let's fix it, we create this strange system where you have to jump through hoops just to say the obvious. I'm sitting here making this podcast, carefully explaining the thought step by step, hoping that maybe it reaches someone who talks to someone who talks to someone else. And eventually, the idea reaches someone who actually has the power to do something about it. But here's the thing that keeps bothering me. Why does it have to work like that? Why do we have to jump through hoops to solve problems that are already visible to everyone? Because this conversation has existed for centuries. Philosophers have talked about fairness. Economists have talked about inequality. People have written books, given speeches, debated solutions. But talking about the problem doesn't put out the fucking fire. And at some point, someone has to pick up the hose. So maybe the first step isn't pretending the fire isn't even there. Maybe the first step is fixing the foundation and then watching what happens next. So there it is. That's finished the thought. I gave you a thought. Sit with it. Think about it. And talk to me about it in the comments. Debate it with your friends. Do whatever you want with it. This is my thought. This was another episode of Let's Finish the Thought. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to me. My name is Ange. You can follow me on Instagram at Ange.Sangash. Ange is spelled out A-N-G S-A-N-G-A-S-H. But thank you for being here. Please leave a like, leave a comment, talk to me, and I will see you guys in the next episode. Later, Gator.